The Saturday before everything ended, my daughter Lily asked me why birds always knew when a storm was coming. She was 7, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with a bowl of cereal balanced on her knee, watching a cardinal on the windowsill tilt its head toward a sky that hadn't yet turned gray. I told her birds could feel pressure changes in the air, tiny shifts that humans couldn't detect. She chewed on that for a moment, then said, "Maybe we used to feel it too, and we just forgot how." I think about that constantly now. I think about whether some part of me felt the pressure drop that morning and simply refused to acknowledge it. My name is Sean McGuire. I was 36 years old, a building inspector for Maricopa County, living in a 4-bedroom house in Gilbert, Arizona, with my wife Rachel, our daughter Lily, and my mother-in-law Dolores, who had moved in the previous October after her hip replacement. We were not survivalists. We were not preppers. We had a 72-hour kit in the garage because Rachel's workplace had sent home a FEMA pamphlet. And she was the kind of person who actually followed through on pamphlets. That kit contained 3 gallons of water, a hand crank radio, some granola bars, a first aid pouch, and a deck of playing cards. I remember the playing cards because later, when I was holding my daughter in the back of a stranger's truck doing 90 down a dirt road, I found the deck in the bag and thought about how perfectly it captured what we'd believed disaster was. An inconvenience you'd wait out with card games. That Saturday morning, June 14th, was supposed to be ordinary. Dolores had a physical therapy appointment at 10. Rachel was prepping for a curriculum meeting. I was planning to recaulk the master bathroom. The neighborhood was the kind of place where ordinary was the entire point. Stucco walls, identical mailboxes, a community pool that smelled like chlorine and sunscreen. The HOA sent emails about lawn height. That was the scale of our crises. The knock came at 8:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd just checked my phone while waiting for the coffee maker to finish its cycle. And I remember thinking it was too early for a Saturday visitor. Rachel was in the shower. Dolores was doing her stretches in the guest room. Lily was still on the kitchen floor with her cereal. I opened the front door to a man I didn't recognize. He was maybe 45, Hispanic, wearing a sweat-soaked t-shirt and running shoes, and he had the kind of face I've only seen a few times in my life. The face of someone who is functioning on adrenaline and willpower after everything rational has been stripped away. His hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking, like he'd been holding something heavy for hours and had just let go. "You need to get your family in a car," he said. "No introduction, no preamble. You need to leave in the next 20 minutes and drive north." I stared at him. I think I almost laughed. In the neighborhood I lived in, unsolicited urgency from strangers usually meant someone was trying to sell solar panels or had found a lost dog. "I'm sorry," I said. "Do I know you?" "My name is Victor Reyes. I'm a paramedic with Southwest Ambulance. I've been on shift since yesterday afternoon." He paused, and I watched his jaw tighten like he was physically holding back something too large for his mouth. "I came off the 202 20 minutes ago. I've been going door to door on this street. You're the 9th house. Please listen to me. There is a contagion event spreading south from Scottsdale, and by midday it will reach this area. The hospitals are already gone." Behind me, Lily set her cereal bowl on the counter. The spoon clinked against the rim. Victor Reyes flinched at the sound like it was a gunshot. "I'm not going to stand here and convince you," he said. "I've seen what this does. The people it affects don't die. They change, and they are fast." He looked past me into the house, then back at me with something worse than fear, resignation. You have a child in there. I can hear her. Get her out." That was the moment the cardinal flew away from the windowsill. I did not believe him. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty is the only currency I have left, and spending it carelessly would dishonor the people I lost. I stood in my doorway and looked at Victor Reyes with the particular condescension of a man whose understanding of the world has never been seriously challenged. I assessed him the way I'd assess a cracked foundation, clinically looking for the flaw that explained the damage. "Have you called the police?" I asked. It was the question of someone who still believed in systems. Victor pulled his phone from his pocket and held up the screen. The call log showed 17 outgoing calls to 911, all under 10 seconds. "Circuits are flooded," he said. "Have been since about 4 a.m. Try yours." I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I turned and called Rachel's name up the stairs. She appeared at the landing a minute later, hair wet, wearing a towel, reading my expression with the fluency of 12 years of marriage. "What's going on?" "There's a man at the door who says we need to evacuate." She came down the stairs faster than I expected. Rachel had grown up in Oklahoma, tornado country, and the word evacuate triggered something in her that it didn't trigger in me. She'd been through warnings before. She knew what hesitation cost. When Rachel reached the door and saw Victor, she didn't ask him if he was credible. She asked him where we should go. That difference between us, my instinct to evaluate, her instinct to act, is the reason our daughter is alive. Victor pointed north. Flagstaff, Sedona, anything above 4,000 feet. The spread is following population density south through the valley. The 101 is already compromised. Take the 87 through Payson if you can. Avoid the interstate. "What exactly is spreading?" Rachel asked. Victor hesitated for the first time. I watched his composure buckle just for a second, like a steel beam that takes weight and bends before it either holds or breaks. At about 6 p.m. yesterday, we started getting calls for aggravated assault in clusters around Scottsdale and North Phoenix. Dispatch thought it was a drug event, maybe a contaminated batch of something. We were treating bite wounds, lacerations, people in extreme agitation. By midnight, the people we'd treated were presenting the same symptoms as the attackers: violent disorientation, loss of verbal function, targeted aggression toward anyone nearby. He stopped and pressed his palm flat against our doorframe like he needed the solidity of it. By 3 a.m., Banner Desert was overrun, not by patients, by what the patients became. Dolores appeared behind us in the hallway, leaning on her cane. "Sean, who's at the door?" I turned to face my mother-in-law, a 68-year-old woman who had survived breast cancer and a failed marriage, and who walked with a limp that she'd learned to make look dignified. And I realized I was going to have to decide in the next 60 seconds whether to upend her mourning based on the testimony of a stranger on my porch. Rachel decided for me. "Mom, go pack a bag. One bag. Clothes, medications, shoes you can walk in. We're leaving in 15 minutes. Dolores looked at her daughter, then at me, then at Victor. She didn't argue. She turned and moved toward the guest room at a speed I hadn't seen from her since before the surgery. "I have to keep going," Victor said. "There are more houses on this block." "Wait," I said. "How many people have listened to you so far?" He looked at me, and the answer was in his eyes before his mouth formed it. 2 families out of 9. He left. I watched him jog across the street to the Hendersons' place and knock. I watched Gary Henderson open the door in his bathrobe. I watched the conversation from a distance, the gestures, the head shaking, the door closing while Victor was still mid-sentence. Rachel was already inside, moving. I could hear drawers opening, and her voice giving Lily calm, specific instructions. "Put your shoes on, baby. The ones that tie. Get your backpack and put Mr. Rabbit in it." I stood on the porch for another 10 seconds. The street was quiet. Sprinklers were running 3 houses down. A jogger passed on the sidewalk with earbuds in, oblivious. The sky was pale blue and cloudless. It was 89 degrees and climbing, a standard June morning in the Arizona suburbs. Then I heard something I couldn't place. A sound carried on the still air from the south, low and layered, like distant traffic but without the rhythm of engines. It pulsed, it swelled, it didn't stop. I went inside and locked the door. The next 12 minutes were the most efficient my household had ever been, and I attribute that entirely to Rachel. While I was still processing Victor's words through the slow machinery of disbelief, she had already packed the car. The 72-hour kit went in the trunk, 2 duffel bags with clothes, the lockbox from the bedroom closet with our passports, and the deed to the house, a case of water bottles from the pantry, Lily's backpack, Dolores's medications, 3 different bottles, a blood pressure cuff, and the compression socks her therapist had prescribed. I moved through the house, disconnecting from things I didn't realize I was connected to. I grabbed my laptop, then set it down. I picked up a framed photo of Lily's first birthday, then put it back. The brain, under sudden duress, treats objects as anchors, and releasing each one required a small, private act of severance that I didn't fully understand until later. "Sean," Rachel's voice from the garage. Firm, not loud. "Now." I pulled Lily's rain jacket from the hook by the back door, an absurd choice for June in Arizona. But my hands were acting independently of logic, and walked into the garage where my family was waiting inside our Hyundai Tucson. Dolores was in the back seat with Lily. Rachel was in the passenger seat. She'd left the driver's seat for me because she knew I needed the illusion of control. I backed out of the driveway at 9:03 a.m. The street looked entirely normal. Mrs. Camacho was watering her roses 2 doors down. A kid from the next block was riding his bike in slow circles at the cul-de-sac. I had the irrational urge to roll down my window and shout at them. To be Victor Reyes for someone else. But Rachel put her hand on my arm and said, "Drive." I took Val Vista north toward the 202. Rachel was on her phone, trying to reach her sister in Tempe. The call connected once, rang twice, and dropped. She tried again. Nothing. She tried her office. Nothing. She opened a browser and searched for local news. The top result from AZ Central, time-stamped 40 minutes earlier, had a headline that read, "Multiple mass casualty events reported across Scottsdale. Residents urged to shelter in place." Below it was a photograph of a hospital parking lot where the cars were arranged at wrong angles, some with doors open, some with shattered windshields. And in the background, at the edge of the frame, 3 figures were running in a way that didn't look right. Limbs too loose, posture too forward, covering ground too quickly. Rachel turned the phone face down on her lap. "What is it?" Dolores asked from the back. "It's real," Rachel said quietly. We reached the 202 interchange and found it moving, but slowly. Traffic was heavy for a Saturday morning, not gridlocked, not yet, but thick with an energy I could feel through the wheel. People were driving with intention. Fewer lane changes than usual. Fewer people on phones. A collective, silent awareness that something was pulling everyone in the same direction. I merged onto the highway heading east toward the junction with the 87, which would take us north through the Tonto National Forest toward Payson. Victor had said to avoid the interstate, and the 87 was a two-lane highway for much of its length, which meant it could bottleneck easily. But it also meant fewer population centers and fewer chances of encountering whatever was spreading behind us. "Daddy, are we going on a trip?" Lily asked. "Yeah, baby, a surprise trip." "Where?" "Up to the mountains, where it's cool." She accepted this with the easy trust of a child who has never been lied to by her parents about anything that mattered. That trust was a weight I carried in my chest like a stone. We passed the exit for Mesa, and I checked the rearview mirror. The skyline of Phoenix was behind us, still gleaming, still standing, still looking exactly like it had every day of the 8 years I'd lived beneath it. There was no smoke, no helicopters, no visible sign that the city was hemorrhaging from within. Catastrophe, I was learning, doesn't announce itself with spectacle. It spreads through whisper networks and overwhelmed call centers and paramedics going door to door at dawn because the official channels have already failed. Rachel turned on the radio. Static on 3 stations. The 4th carried a syndicated morning show from out of state, the hosts laughing about a celebrity divorce. The 5th was an emergency broadcast tone, that long, flat, droning note that I'd heard in tests 100 times, but never in practice. She turned it off. The 87 narrowed from 4 lanes to 2 just past Fountain Hills, and the change felt like a constriction in the throat of the landscape itself. The suburban sprawl fell away. Strip malls and housing developments replaced by open desert, saguaro cactus standing like sentries. The Mazatzal Mountains rising ahead of us in rust and shadow. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Under these circumstances, beauty registered as vulnerability. Open space meant visibility. Visibility meant exposure. Traffic was steady, but not yet desperate. I counted the vehicles ahead of us, maybe 40 within visible range, all heading north, all maintaining speed, all driven by people who had apparently received the same message through different channels. Some had luggage strapped to roofs. One pickup truck carried an entire family in the bed, 5 people sitting on sleeping bags with a German shepherd panting between them. No one honked. No one cut anyone off. The highway had the atmosphere of a funeral procession. Ordered, somber, driven by a shared understanding that the thing behind them was not negotiable. Rachel had managed to send a text to her sister Janine in Tempe. The response came 18 minutes later, 5 words. "Can't leave. Roads blocked here." Rachel typed back a long message. Instructions, please, the names of alternate routes, and never received a reply. She held the phone for another 10 minutes before placing it in the cup holder with deliberate care, as if setting down something fragile that had already broken. Dolores was quiet in the back seat, watching the desert pass, one hand resting on Lily's knee. She hadn't asked more questions after Rachel's confirmation in the car, and I understood that silence as a form of conservation. She was rationing her energy, emotional and physical, for whatever came next. She'd been doing that her whole life. Breast cancer had taught her to economize suffering. Lily fell asleep at mile marker 204. She curled into Dolores's side with Mr. Rabbit, a stuffed animal so old and worn that one ear was held on with safety pins, and her breathing went slow and even. And in the rear-view mirror, I watched her small chest rise and fall, and I made a promise to myself that I would get her somewhere safe, or I would die in the process of trying. This was not dramatic. This was arithmetic, the simplest equation I'd ever solved. We climbed in elevation. The temperature gauge on the dashboard dropped from 97 to 91 to 84. The vegetation shifted: juniper, pinon, scrub oak. The air coming through the vents thinned and tasted different, drier and sharper, stripped of the valley's heavy particulate haze. I cracked the window an inch and listened. Wind, tires on asphalt, nothing else. At the Sunflower Rest area, about 50 miles north of the valley, I pulled off because the gas gauge was approaching a quarter tank and there were 2 pumps visible from the road. The rest area was a dirt lot with a cinder block restroom and a covered picnic table. And when I pulled in, there were already a dozen vehicles parked at various angles, most of them running with people inside. I told Rachel to stay in the car with Dolores and Lily. She looked at me and nodded, and the nod contained an entire language. "Be careful. Come back. Don't take long. I love you." I walked to the pump and found it operational. Credit card reader functional. No line. I swiped my card and began filling the tank, and felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the open desert around me. A woman approached from a white Subaru parked nearby. She was maybe 50, silver-haired, wearing hiking clothes and a medical ID badge clipped to her collar that read, "Scottsdale Osborne Drive, K. Leung." Her eyes were red-rimmed and her posture was rigid, the kind of controlled stillness that comes from clinical training meeting personal horror. "Which way did you come?" she asked. "Gilbert, through the valley." "How far back are they?" The question hit me like cold water. How far back are they? Presupposed a they that was moving, that was measurable, that was following. "I don't know," I said. "We left before we saw anything directly." She looked south, squinting against the sun. "I was at Osborne when it reached the campus at 4 this morning. I've been driving for 5 hours. I stopped here because I can't stop shaking long enough to maintain speed." I looked at her hands. She was holding her car keys in a fist, and the fist was vibrating. "They came through the emergency entrance," she said, her voice clinical and flat and breaking at the seams. "Staff first, then patients, then it was everywhere." "Doctor." Leung told me 3 things in that parking lot that changed how I understood what was behind us, and I'll relay them in the order she said them because the sequence mattered. First, the incubation period was short. She'd watched a colleague get bitten at 4:15 a.m. and turn by 4:40, 25 minutes from exposure to full behavioral change. The infected didn't collapse or convulse or go through any cinematic transformation. They simply stopped, stood still for a brief window, she estimated 60 to 90 seconds, and then began moving with a different intent. The eyes changed last. She said the eyes were the hardest part because for a few seconds you could still see the person in them, and then you couldn't. Second, they weren't mindless. The infected avoided obstacles, navigated doorways, used stairs. They didn't use tools or speak, but their spatial reasoning was intact. They pursued targets with a directional focus that suggested something more organized than rage. She used the word predatory, then corrected herself to acquisitive. Then went quiet for a moment, as if neither word was sufficient. Third, they were drawn to sound. She'd observed this multiple times during her escape from the hospital. Alarms, car horns, shouting. Any sustained noise above a certain volume attracted concentrated movement. The infected would converge on a sound source from multiple directions, and the convergence was rapid. She estimated that a car alarm in an open area could draw dozens within minutes. I absorbed this standing next to a gas pump in the Arizona highlands, the nozzle clicking off as the tank filled. And I felt the architecture of my assumptions collapse silently, like a building imploding from the inside. Everything I thought I knew about safety, locks, walls, police, hospitals, was predicated on threats that operated within human social parameters. What Dr. Liang described operated outside those parameters entirely. It was not criminal. It was not political. It was biological. And biology doesn't negotiate. "Where are you headed?" I asked her. "Payson, initially. But I don't think Payson is far enough. There are 12,000 people there, and if even a fraction are already infected..." She trailed off, looking at the line of vehicles moving north on the highway. "I'm going to try to reach Heber Overgaard. Small population, elevation, limited access roads. Can I follow you?" She studied me, then looked past me to the Hyundai, where Rachel was watching from the passenger seat. "You have family in the car?" "Wife, daughter, mother-in-law." "Your mother-in-law. Is she mobile?" "She uses a cane. Hip replacement 6 months ago." Dr. Liang's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalculated. I saw it happen. She was running triage math in her head, assessing our group's viability. And the assessment included a 68-year-old woman with limited mobility. And the answer to that assessment was not favorable. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. "Follow me," she said. "Stay close. If I stop, you stop. If I accelerate, match it." I replaced the nozzle, got back in the car, and told Rachel what I'd learned. I kept my voice even. I edited nothing. Rachel listened with her eyes closed, her fingers interlaced in her lap. And when I finished, she opened her eyes and said, "We need to tell your mother." She meant Dolores. She'd never called Dolores my mother before. Always your mom or mom directly. The shift in language was small but seismic. It was Rachel acknowledging that the bonds between us had just been compressed by external force into something tighter and more essential. We pulled back onto the 87 behind Dr. Liang's white Subaru. The road climbed steadily. Pine trees began to appear among the juniper. The sky deepened from pale desert blue to the darker, richer blue of altitude. Lily woke up, looked out the window and said, "It smells like Christmas trees." We were passing through the small community of pine, scattered houses among the trees, when the first evidence appeared on the road itself. A gray sedan sat diagonal across the northbound lane, both front doors open, the driver's side airbag deployed. There was no one inside. There was no one around it. But on the asphalt, near the passenger door, there was a single shoe, a woman's sandal, white, lying on its side, and the absence of the person who'd worn it was louder than any alarm. Dr. Liang navigated around the sedan without stopping. I followed. Dolores put her hand over Lily's eyes gently and said, "Rest a little more, sweet girl." We reached Payson at 11:40 a.m. The town sits at 5,000 feet in the Mogollon Rim country, a former logging community turned retirement and recreation hub. Population roughly 12,000 in the summer months. Under normal conditions, it was the kind of place where you stopped for gas and pie on your way to somewhere else. Under these conditions, it was a bottleneck. The 87 feeds directly into Payson's main commercial strip, and when we crested the final hill and saw the town spread below us, the road ahead was solid with vehicles. Not moving, parked, idling, some turned off entirely. People were standing outside their cars, talking in clusters, looking south, looking at their phones, looking at each other with expressions that ranged from confused to terrified to blank. A Coconino County Sheriff's cruiser was parked sideways at the first intersection, lights flashing, and a deputy was directing traffic into a single lane that funneled toward a parking lot where someone had set up folding tables with water bottles. Dr. Liang pulled to the shoulder, and I pulled in behind her. She got out and walked back to my window. "This is wrong," she said. They're concentrating people. One location, high density, no perimeter. She was speaking in the clipped, assessment-based language of emergency medicine, and I understood immediately what she meant. If the infected were drawn to sound, gathering hundreds of frightened people in a single parking lot was building a beacon. "We go around," I said. "There's a forest road east of town that connects to the 260 toward Heber. I've used it before. It's rough, but passable. We need to leave the highway before the bottleneck." I looked in my rearview mirror. Dolores was watching us through the window, reading our body language, her face composed, but her hand tight around the grip of her cane. Lily was tracing shapes on the foggy glass with her finger. Rachel was already pulling up a map on her phone. We backtracked a quarter mile to a dirt road that branched east, marked only by a faded Forest Service sign and a cattle guard. Dr. Liang's Subaru had all-wheel drive and handled the terrain. My Hyundai was less enthusiastic. The road was rutted and narrow, flanked by ponderosa pines whose trunks were close enough to scrape the mirrors if I drifted. Dust billowed behind us in a visible trail that made me nervous. We were leaving a signal. 3 miles in, we encountered another vehicle coming toward us. A red pickup truck, moving fast on the narrow road, forcing Dr. Liang to pull hard to the right to avoid a collision. The truck barely slowed. As it passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver. A young man, maybe 20, gripping the wheel with both hands, mouth open, face pale, alone in the cab. The truck bed was empty. He was running from something specific. We kept driving. The forest thickened. The road descended into a shallow valley where a dry creek bed crossed the track, then climbed again through a meadow bordered by charred trees from a previous wildfire. The burned landscape looked skeletal, all black trunks and gray ash. And I felt the metaphor in my bones, even as I rejected it. 40 minutes later, the dirt road intersected with Highway 260, and Dr. Liang turned east toward Heber Overguard. We were now roughly 100 miles from Gilbert. The valley, Phoenix, Scottsdale. Everything behind us had become an abstraction, a place that existed in past tense. Rachel spoke for the first time in an hour. "I can't reach Janine." I didn't respond. I didn't have a response that wasn't cruel or dishonest. Janine was in Tempe. Tempe was adjacent to Scottsdale. The math was simple, and the answer was the kind you don't speak aloud. "She's smart," I said instead. "She's resourceful." "She's alone," Rachel said. The word alone filled the car like water filling a sinking vessel. Dolores, in the back seat, reached forward and placed her hand on Rachel's shoulder. Rachel covered it with her own and held it there. No one spoke again until we saw the first buildings of Heber appear through the trees. Dr. Liang's brake lights flared red. She stopped in the middle of the road. I stopped behind her. She got out slowly, walked to the center line, and stood very still, looking at something I couldn't see from my lower vantage point. I told Rachel to stay and got out. Walked forward to where Dr. Liang was standing. Looked where she was looking. The highway ahead was scattered with debris. Clothes, a stroller, a cooler with its lid open and contents melted across the asphalt. And beyond the debris, at the edge of the tree line, something was moving between the trunks. Not walking, not running. Moving with that particular cadence that sits between the two, fluid and deliberate and wrong. Dr. Liang said very quietly, "They're already here." We didn't freeze. I want to note that because I'd always assumed I was the kind of person who would freeze in a moment like that, who would stand slack-jawed while the threat materialized, burning precious seconds on disbelief. Instead, something activated in my lower brain, something ancestral and unsentimental, and I was back in my car with the door closed before the figure in the trees had fully emerged from the shadows. "Turn around," Rachel asked. She'd read the situation from my face. "No. Dr. Liang says there's a side road half a mile back, a ranch property, gated." I'd barely spoken to Dr. Liang. She'd communicated the plan in fragments, pointed at a turnoff, held up 5 fingers, mouthed, "Follow." And we'd both returned to our vehicles with the economy of people who understood that sound was currency, and we were spending too much. The figure at the tree line had been joined by 2 others. They stood at the edge of the pavement in a loose configuration, heads tilted at angles that suggested listening rather than looking. Their clothes were civilian: jeans, a flannel shirt, a fast food uniform. Their postures were civilian, but the way they held themselves in space was not. There was an intentionality to their stillness that a healthy person doesn't produce. Healthy people fidget, shift weight, look around. These 3 were locked onto something, a direction, a frequency, and every part of their bodies was oriented toward it. I reversed, following Dr. Liang's Subaru back down the highway. The turnoff she'd indicated was a gravel drive that branched south off the 260, marked by a metal gate that was currently open and a sign that read, "Cortland Ranch Private Property." Beyond the gate, the drive curved through a stand of aspens before opening into a cleared area with several structures: a main house, 2 outbuildings, a horse barn, and a large metal shop building. It looked like a working ranch, maybe 50 acres, bordered by forest on 3 sides and a low ridge to the south. There were already people there. 4 vehicles were parked in the yard, and a dozen adults were standing in a loose group near the main house. They watched us approach with the wariness of people who had been making decisions about who to let in and were not yet finished. Dr. Liang parked and got out with her hands visible, palms forward, a universal gesture of non-threat. I followed her lead, stepping out slowly, keeping my hands away from my body. Rachel stayed in the car with Dolores and Lily. A man stepped forward from the group. He was tall, mid-50s, sun-weathered, wearing a canvas jacket and a ball cap with a faded ranch supply logo. His face was calm in the way that certain men's faces are calm. Not because they lack fear, but because they've decided that calm is more useful and have committed to the decision. "I'm Dale Cortland," he said. "This is my property. Dr. Karen Liang, Scottsdale Osborne Medical Center. This is Sean McGuire. We're coming from the valley. We encountered infected on the 260 east of here. 3 individuals, possibly more in the tree line." Dale Cortland absorbed this without visible reaction. He looked past us to my Hyundai, where Rachel's face was visible in the window. "How many in your group?" "5, counting us. My wife, daughter, and mother-in-law. My mother-in-law has limited mobility." His eyes stayed on the car a beat longer than comfortable. I recognized the same calculation I'd seen in Dr. Liang at the gas station, the triage math, the resource assessment, the cold algebra of survival that factors in who can run and who can't. I hated it. I understood it. "Come inside," Dale said. "Bring your people. We're figuring out what to do." The main house was a single-story ranch home, well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and a mudroom cluttered with boots and tack equipment. Inside, the living room had been converted into a command center of sorts. A topographic map of the area was spread on the dining table, weighted down with coffee mugs, and a battery-powered radio was hissing static on the kitchen counter. I helped Dolores out of the car. She moved slowly across the gravel, her cane finding uneven ground. And Lily held her other hand with the solemn attentiveness of a child who has decided to be helpful without being asked. Rachel carried the bags. Dr. Liang carried her medical kit. We filed into Dale Cortland's house like refugees, which is precisely what we were, though the word wouldn't feel accurate for another 2 days. The other survivors introduced themselves in the quick, compressed manner of people who know that names are placeholders for trust not yet earned. There was Marcus Webb, a long-haul trucker from Holbrook, whose rig had jackknifed on the 260 when a group of infected ran across the highway. He'd abandoned the truck and flagged down a passing car driven by a woman named Irene Salazar, a retired schoolteacher from Show Low who'd left her home at dawn after hearing screaming from her neighbor's property. There was Thomas Herrera, a wildland firefighter stationed at the Heber Ranger District who'd arrived at the ranch in a Forest Service pickup truck with his partner, a younger firefighter named Becca Osorio. They'd been on a prescribed burn detail when their radio filled with cross-traffic from emergency services across 3 counties, all reporting the same phenomenon. And there was a couple, Nathan and Grace Park, who'd been camping at Woods Canyon Lake and had driven to the ranch after encountering a roadblock of abandoned vehicles on the forest road. Dale Cortland's ranch had advantages. It sat on elevated ground with clear sight lines in 3 directions. The property had a well with a hand pump, a propane generator, a root cellar stocked with canned goods, and a barn that could be secured. Dale was a former Marine, Vietnam era, and he'd built the property with a practical self-sufficiency that now looked less like eccentricity and more like prescience. His wife, Patricia, was the quiet axis around which the household's logistics turned. She was already organizing the kitchen, inventorying food, setting up sleeping arrangements. She'd placed a kettle on the stove and was making coffee for everyone. And the normalcy of that gesture, coffee in ceramic mugs with sugar available, was so dissonant with our circumstances that several people held their cups without drinking, unable to reconcile the warmth in their hands with the cold in their chests. Dr. Liang took charge of the medical assessment. She checked Dolores's blood pressure, confirmed her medications, and quietly told me that stress elevation aside, Dolores was stable. She examined Lily, who submitted to the stethoscope with wide eyes, and pronounced her healthy. She asked each person in the group whether they had any injuries, any bites, any contact with infected individuals. Everyone answered no. The question hung in the room after it was asked, because everyone understood its implication. If anyone had lied, the consequences would metabolize within 25 minutes. Tomas spread a larger map on the table. A Forest Service topographic sheet that showed every road, trail, and contour line within a 50-mile radius. He traced possible routes, choke points, natural barriers. Becca supplemented with what they'd heard on the radio before it went dark. The infection had spread south through the valley to Chandler and west to Goodyear. It had reached Prescott. It had reached Flagstaff. The governor had declared a state of emergency at 6 a.m. And by 8 a.m., the declaration was irrelevant because the infrastructure required to enforce it no longer functioned. "How fast does it spread?" Dale asked. Dr. Liang answered. She laid out the 25-minute incubation, the sound attraction, the retained spatial awareness. She spoke in clinical language, and the room listened with the silence of people receiving a diagnosis. "So, what's the play?" Marcus asked. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a large man with calloused hands and an expression that suggested he preferred problems that could be solved with torque and diesel fuel. "We stay here and hope it doesn't reach us? We run again?" "If it's already in the tree line east of town, it'll reach this property," Tomas said. "Question is when." "This house is defensible," Dale said. Stone foundation, limited entry points. I have firearms, a rifle, a shotgun, 2 handguns, ammunition for all of them. Firearms work against people, Dr. Liang said carefully. What I saw at the hospital, these aren't people anymore. Physiologically, yes. Behaviorally, no. I watched a security guard empty a magazine into an infected woman, and she continued moving until blood loss caused her to collapse. That took over a minute. The room recalibrated. I watched it happen on each face individually. The adjustment of expectation, the deletion of assumptions, the quiet internal revision of what defensible actually meant. So what stops them? Nathan Park asked. He was holding Grace's hand, and his grip was white-knuckled. Structural damage, Dr. Liang said. Trauma to the legs eliminates mobility. Sufficient blood loss causes eventual incapacitation. The brain still governs motor function, so cranial trauma is immediately effective. But these are not strategies for sustained defense. These are last resorts. Patricia Cortland set a plate of sandwiches on the table. No one touched them. She left them there anyway, understanding that the food's purpose was psychological, a statement that order still existed, that someone was still providing. We spent the afternoon fortifying. Dale assigned tasks with the efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing labor. And no one questioned his authority because authority, in that moment, was indistinguishable from competence. Tomas and Becca secured the barn, reinforcing the sliding doors with 2x4s nailed horizontally across the frame and parking the Forest Service truck against the main entrance as a barricade. Marcus and Nathan moved Dale's tractor to block the main gate at the gravel drive, creating a barrier that wouldn't stop a vehicle but would funnel foot traffic into a visible choke point. Dr. Liang set up a medical station in the master bedroom, laying out supplies from her kit and from Dale's first aid cabinet with the practiced spatial arrangement of someone who'd worked trauma bays. I was assigned to the water detail, filling every available container from the well pump. Buckets, pots, coolers, the bathtub, 2 horse troughs. Rachel and Irene inventoried food. Patricia organized sleeping spaces. Grace Park, who turned out to be a structural engineer, walked the property's perimeter and identified weak points. A section of fence behind the barn that was only wire. A cellar window that didn't latch. A stretch of the southern tree line that was close enough to the house that it provided concealment for approach. Dolores sat on the porch with Lily and played cards. They used the deck from our emergency kit, the one I'd dismissed as absurd 12 hours earlier. Lily was teaching Dolores a game she'd invented, and Dolores was losing with theatrical exasperation. And from across the yard, I could hear Lily's laughter, pure and undamaged, and so utterly incongruent with the reality surrounding it that I had to stop what I was doing and stand still for a moment until my breathing leveled. By late afternoon, the ranch felt marginally more secure. Dale walked the group through the layout, pointing out fields of fire from the windows, a phrase that sounded alien in a residential context, and established a watch rotation. Tomas and Becca would take first watch, midnight to 4. Marcus and Dale would take 4 to 8. Nathan and I would take 8 to noon. Dr. Liang was exempt from watch to remain available for medical emergencies. The women with children, a category that included Rachel and, by extension, Dolores, were assigned to interior security, meaning they would keep the doors locked and monitored while the watch pairs patrolled the perimeter. Irene Salazar objected to this arrangement. She was 62, sharp-featured, and had the bearing of a woman who had spent decades managing classrooms full of adolescents, which is to say, she did not accept exclusion gracefully. "I've been shooting since I was 10, she told Dale. "My father was a hunting guide in the White Mountains. I'll take a watch." Dale looked at her, nodded once, and adjusted the rotation without comment. Irene took Nathan's slot. Nathan, who looked privately relieved, was reassigned to interior support. Dinner was canned chili, crackers, and sliced apples from a tree in Dale's yard. We ate on the porch in the last light, 14 people seated on mismatched chairs and overturned buckets, eating from mismatched bowls, watching the sun go down behind the ridge and turn the sky the color of a healing bruise, purple at the edges, red at the center, fading to black at the top. No one spoke much. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people conserving themselves, storing reserves for what the night might bring. Lily fell asleep in Rachel's arms before full dark. Rachel carried her inside and put her on the bed Patricia had made up in the guest room. A real bed with clean sheets and a quilted comforter. Comforts that felt almost transgressive in their softness. Dolores followed, settling into an armchair beside the bed with a blanket over her legs and her cane within reach. I stood in the doorway and watched my family arrange themselves for sleep in a stranger's house, in a town they'd never visited. And I felt a gratitude so acute it bordered on grief. They were alive. They were safe for now. The qualifying phrase was a blade that cut both ways. Rachel came to the door and leaned against the frame beside me. "How are you?" she asked. "Functional." That's not what I asked. I know. I looked at her. In the dim light of the hallway, her face was all angles and shadow, and I loved her with a ferocity that embarrassed me. "I'm terrified," I said. "I'm terrified, and I'm angry, and I don't know what I'm angry at." She put her hand on my chest, over my heart. "It doesn't matter what you're angry at. It matters what you do next." She was right. She was always right about the things that actually mattered. The first night passed without incident, and the absence of incident was its own form of torture. Every sound, wind through pine branches, a coyote's distant call, the settling groans of the old house, registered as potential threat and demanded a response that amounted to standing very still and listening until the sound resolved into something identifiable. Thomas and Becca reported nothing during their shift. Marcus and Dale reported an elk crossing the meadow at 5 a.m. that nearly caused Marcus to discharge his shotgun. Morning brought clarity of light and opacity of information. The radio produced only static. Cell service was non-existent. We were operating on the last information we'd received, which was hours old and degrading in relevance with every minute. The world beyond the ranch's property line was a black box at 9 a.m. During my watch with Irene, we heard gunfire to the east. 3 reports, spaced evenly, from a distance I estimated at 2 to 3 miles. Then silence. Then, after perhaps a minute, a longer burst. 5 or 6 shots in rapid succession, the cadence of someone firing at something that was still coming. Irene lowered the binoculars she'd been scanning the tree line with and looked at me. "That's closer than I'd like." We reported to Dale. He assembled the group in the living room. Patricia poured coffee. The routine of coffee was becoming an anchor, a liturgical act performed at the boundary between what we could control and what we couldn't. "We need information," Dale said. "We can't make decisions blind." Tomas volunteered to take the Forest Service truck on a reconnaissance run east toward the 260 to assess the situation in Heber. Dale wanted to go with him. Dr. Liang argued against sending 2 people and suggested Tomas go alone, reasoning that if 1 person didn't return, the group retained more capability than if 2 didn't. The logic was sound and brutal, and Tomas accepted it without visible emotion. He checked the truck's fuel, took a handheld radio from the Ranger District kit, Useless for outside communication, but functional for short-range contact with the matching unit. He left with Becca and drove out at 9:30. He was back by 10:15. He parked the truck, sat in the cab for a full minute before getting out, and when he walked into the house, his face had the texture of someone who had seen something that had rearranged the furniture of his understanding. "Heber is gone," he said. "The town center is overrun. I counted at least 50 infected in a 3-block radius. They're in houses, in the streets, in the parking lot of the grocery store. Some of them are just standing still. Others are moving south in a loose group, following the highway." "South toward us," Marcus said. "South toward us," Tomas confirmed. "I estimate 4 to 6 hours before the leading edge reaches this area, depending on speed and whether anything attracts their attention before then." The room divided instantly, not into factions, not yet, but into psychological camps defined by their response to the information. Dale, Thomas, Becca, and Irene oriented toward defense. Fortify, hold, fight if necessary. Marcus, Nathan, and Grace oriented toward flight. Pack up, move west, find somewhere more remote. Dr. Liang oriented toward assessment. Gather more data, understand the pattern, make an informed decision. Rachel oriented toward our family. What option gave Lily and Dolores the best chance? I stood at the intersection of all 4 orientations and felt the pull of each. "We can't outrun them indefinitely," Dale said. "Every time we move, we burn fuel we can't replace and expose ourselves on roads we can't secure. This property has resources, defensible terrain, and enough people to maintain a perimeter." "This property has one exit," Grace countered. "If they surround us, we're trapped." "There's a forest trail south over the ridge," Dale said. "A TV width. It drops into a drainage that leads to the rim road. It's an escape route." "Can a 68-year-old woman with a hip replacement walk an ATV trail?" Marcus asked. He wasn't being cruel. He was asking the question that everyone had been thinking and no one had voiced. The room went silent. I felt the silence press against me like a physical weight. Dolores, seated in the armchair with Lily on the floor beside her, looked up and met my eyes across the room. Her expression was composed, dignified, and utterly lucid. She knew exactly what had been asked and what it implied. "I can walk," she said. "Slowly, but I can walk." We stayed. The decision was not unanimous, but it was collective, which is a distinction that matters. Nathan and Grace wanted to leave, but agreed to remain with the group because separation reduced everyone's odds. Marcus deferred to the majority with the pragmatism of a man who'd spent his career adjusting routes based on conditions. Dr. Liang supported staying on the condition that the escape route over the ridge was scouted and prepared in advance. Thomas and Becca scouted the trail that afternoon. They returned with a report. The path was navigable but steep in sections, approximately 2 miles to the rim road, where a vehicle left in advance could provide extraction. Dale offered his ATV, and Becca drove it to the far end of the trail, parking it at the rim road junction with a full tank of gas and the keys in the ignition. She jogged back in 40 minutes, barely winded, and I marveled at the physical competence of someone who ran toward wildfires for a living. By mid-afternoon, the preparations were complete. The ranch was as fortified as civilian materials, and 16 hours of labor could make it. Every window on the ground floor was blocked with furniture. The doors were reinforced with crossbars fashioned from lumber in Dale's shop. The propane generator was fueled and tested. Water containers were full. Food was rationed into 3-day portions. Medical supplies were inventoried and staged. The escape packs, 1 per person containing water, a flashlight, basic first aid, and a portion of food, were lined up by the back door like sentries. Lily asked me why we were putting furniture against the windows. I told her we were making the house extra strong, like a fort. She asked if there were bad guys outside. I said there were sick people outside, people who couldn't help being sick, and we needed to keep them away so we could stay healthy. This was the most honest version of the truth I could construct for a 7-year-old. And it was the version that would haunt me later, not because it was inaccurate, but because it established a framework of compassion that the coming days would systematically dismantle. At 4 p.m., Dale's dog started barking. He had two, a border collie named Ruth and a cattle dog mix named Hank. And they'd been subdued all day, pacing the house with their ears flat, responding to an atmospheric tension that their senses decoded more efficiently than ours. When they began barking, they faced southeast, toward the tree line at the bottom of the meadow. And their barks were not the territorial announcements of dogs defending property. They were warnings, high-pitched, repetitive, almost frantic. Dale silenced them with a hand signal and picked up his rifle. Tomas moved to the south-facing window with binoculars. Becca positioned herself at the back door. The rest of us followed the protocol we'd rehearsed. Rachel and Dolores took Lily to the interior hallway. Patricia secured the kitchen entrance. Nathan and Grace crouched below the east windows. Dr. Liang stood at the medical station with her kit open. Marcus covered the front door with Dale's shotgun, which he handled with a familiarity that suggested a history he hadn't shared. I moved to the window beside Tomas and looked where he was looking. The meadow sloped downward from the house to the tree line, roughly 200 yards of open grass. At the edge of the trees, partially obscured by low branches, something was moving. Not fast, exploratory. A single figure emerged into the open, and even at that distance, the wrongness was visible. The gait was too smooth, too continuous, lacking the micro-hesitations that characterize voluntary human movement. It moved like water finding a channel. A second figure appeared, then a third. They spread laterally along the tree line, maintaining spacing, and I remembered Dr. Liang's word, acquisitive, and understood it now. They weren't charging. They were surveying, learning the terrain. Tomas counted under his breath. 7, 8, 9 visible, unknown in the trees. Dale chambered around. The sound was mechanical and final, a period at the end of a sentence that hadn't yet been written. "Hold," Tomas said. "They're not advancing." We waited. The figures at the tree line stood in their terrible stillness, heads tilted, bodies oriented toward the house. They could hear us, the dogs, our breathing, the creak of floorboards. Every sound we produced was information they were processing. Then Ruth whimpered, a single, involuntary sound. And all 9 heads turned toward the window where we stood. Dale shot Ruth's bark out of the air with a hissed command, but the damage was done. The figures at the tree line began moving, not running, advancing, with the measured pace of predators who knew their prey was stationary. They crossed the meadow in a loose formation, and behind them, more emerged from the trees. 12, 15. I stopped counting at 20 because counting had become an exercise in despair. "Back door. Now," Dale said. His voice was level. His hands were steady. He'd made the calculation faster than the rest of us. The front was compromised. The numbers exceeded our capacity to defend. And the escape plan had just transitioned from contingency to necessity. The next 4 minutes were the most disciplined chaos I've ever experienced. Patricia grabbed the escape packs. Rachel carried Lily, who had buried her face in her mother's neck and gone silent. Not crying, not speaking, just silent, which was worse. Dolores moved through the hallway with her cane striking the hardwood in a rhythm that was too slow, and I could hear the infected outside now. A sound like dozens of hands testing the exterior walls, exploring the surface, finding the seams. Becca had the back door open. The ATV trail started 50 yards behind the barn at the base of the ridge. Between us and the trailhead was open ground. "I'll cover from the barn," Marcus said. He had the shotgun. He looked at me with an expression that I interpreted as both a farewell and a command. "Take your family and go." We ran, Rachel with Lily, moving fast. Me beside Dolores, my arm around her waist, half carrying her. Her cane abandoned somewhere behind us because it was slowing her down. And we had no time for slowness. Dr. Liang beside us, one hand on Dolores's other arm, sharing the weight. Tomas in front, clearing the path. Becca behind, watching our rear. Dale with his rifle, sweeping the flanks. Nathan and Grace carrying packs. Irene moving with the straight-backed efficiency of a woman who'd been told her whole life what she couldn't do and had never once listened. Patricia, last out, pulling the door shut behind her as if closing a house that she knew she would never reopen. From behind the barn, Marcus fired twice. The sound was enormous in the evening air, and I felt it in my diaphragm like a second heartbeat. Then silence. Then a third shot. Then his voice, distant and strange. "Go! They're coming around the east side." We hit the trail. It was narrow, rocky, ascending steeply through pine forest. Tomas led at a pace that the fittest among us could maintain, and the rest could survive. Rachel was ahead of me, Lily's face still pressed to her shoulder. And I watched my wife navigate roots and rocks in near darkness with our child in her arms. And I understood that strength is not a quality, but a decision, made continuously, under conditions that make every repetition harder than the last. Dolores stumbled. Her bad hip betrayed her on a section of loose scree, and she went down on one knee with a sound that was half gasp and half apology. She was apologizing for falling, for slowing us, for being 68 years old with a body that had limits she hadn't chosen. I pulled her up. Dr. Liang steadied her. We kept moving. Behind us, the sounds from the ranch were changing. More gunfire. Marcus was still engaging. Then a crash, structural, like a door giving way. Then Marcus's voice again, but different now. A shout that dissolved into something I don't have language for, something between defiance and the recognition that defiance was no longer sufficient. Then silence from Marcus. We climbed. The trail switched back twice, gaining elevation rapidly. And the air thinned and cooled, and my lungs burned, and Dolores's breathing was ragged, but she did not stop. She did not stop because stopping meant dying, and she was not ready. Not with Lily alive and ahead of her on the trail, not with Rachel's hand reaching back periodically to touch her arm and confirm her presence. We reached the rim road at full dark. The ATV was where Becca had left it, a small miracle in a landscape rapidly running out of them. Becca started it, and its headlight cut a narrow tunnel through the blackness. There was room for two on the ATV. Dale put Dolores on it with Lily, and Becca drove them ahead at walking pace while the rest of us followed on foot. 14 people had entered that ranch. 13 reached the rim road. Marcus Webb, a long-haul trucker from Holbrook who'd stopped his rig for strangers on a highway, did not. We walked the rim road for 3 hours in darkness. The road was unpaved, rutted from monsoon erosion, bordered by forest so dense that the stars were visible only in a narrow band directly overhead. Becca drove the ATV at our pace, its single headlight the only illumination, and we followed it, like pilgrims following a lantern through a landscape that had become hostile in ways both present and philosophical. No one spoke about Marcus. The absence was too fresh, the edges too sharp. Speaking about him would require processing what his death meant, and processing required cognitive resources that were currently allocated to the simpler, more essential task of placing one foot in front of the other. Dolores rode with Lily in her lap, the child asleep again, her body draped across her grandmother with the boneless trust of deep exhaustion. Dolores held her with both arms, her bad hip pressed against the hard seat. And I knew she was in pain, because I could see it in the set of her jaw when the headlight swept past her face. But she made no sound, and she held my daughter with a grip that geological force could not have broken. Dale walked point beside the ATV, rifle across his chest, scanning the tree line with the night-adapted eyes of someone who'd spent 50 years on this land. Patricia walked beside him, matching his pace, her hand occasionally touching his back in a gesture that was both navigational and intimate. A married shorthand that compressed decades of partnership into a single point of contact. Rachel walked beside me. Our hands found each other in the darkness and interlocked. And her palm was cold and damp, and I held it as if holding a lifeline. Because I was. At 11 p.m., the rim road descended into a valley and intersected with a paved highway, the 377, running north toward Holbrook. Dale consulted with Tomas in whispered tones, maps illuminated by the dim screen of a phone at minimum brightness. The options were limited. Continue on foot along forest roads or risk the highway. The highway offered speed but exposure. The forest offered concealment but slowness. And slowness, for our group, was a compounding liability. "There's a ranch supply depot at Pinedale," Dale said. "About 12 miles north. It's possible they have vehicles. More importantly, it has a well and a steel frame building that could shelter us." 12 miles. On foot with our group, that was 6 hours minimum. The ATV could shuttle people in relays, but the noise of the engine was a calculated risk that grew more dangerous with every repetition. "I'll drive the first relay," Becca said. "Dolores and Lily, plus one escort. Nathan, you're the lightest adult. You ride behind." Nathan nodded. Grace gripped his hand, then released it with the controlled release of someone letting go of a rope over a cliff. Deliberately, because holding on was no longer the safer option. The ATV departed. We waited. The silence of the forest at night was not silence at all, but a layered composition of wind, insect song, and the distant calls of animals navigating their own darknesses. I leaned against a pine tree and felt its bark press into my back. And I thought about Marcus standing at the barn with a shotgun, buying minutes for people he'd known for less than a day. And I tried to construct a framework in which that sacrifice made sense, and found that it didn't need to make sense. It needed only to have happened. Sense was a luxury for people with futures long enough to reflect. Becca returned in 40 minutes, alone. They're at the depot. Building is intact. No infected visible within a quarter mile. She ferried the next group, Dr. Liang, Irene, Patricia, and then the next, and then came back for the final load. Rachel, me, Grace, and Tomas. Dale rode with us, standing on the rear bumper, one hand gripping the cargo rack, rifle in the other, a posture so improbable and determined that it bordered on mythic. The Pinedale Depot was a corrugated steel building set back from the highway behind a gravel lot. It sold feed, fencing, tools, and seasonal supplies to the ranching community. The front windows were intact. The doors were locked. Dale broke the rear entrance with a pry bar from the ATV's toolkit, and we filed in and sealed the door behind us. Inside, It smelled like grain dust and motor oil. A smell so mundane and mechanical that it momentarily overrode the primal stench of fear that had permeated every breath for the past 18 hours. Shelves of livestock supplements, racks of barbed wire, a wall of hand tools arranged by size. A small office in the back with a desk, a chair, and a landline phone that, when I picked it up, produced a dial tone so clear and normal that I nearly dropped it. "It works," I said. My voice cracked on the second word. The phone worked for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, we made contact with the outside world for the first and last time. Dale called the Navajo County emergency line. It rang. A dispatcher answered, a woman whose voice was hoarse and strained but professional, maintaining protocol at the edge of a collapsing system. She confirmed what we already knew and added what we didn't. The infection had reached Flagstaff, Prescott, and Kingman to the west. It had crossed into New Mexico along the I-40 corridor. Phoenix was described, in her words, as non-recoverable. Military assets were being deployed from Fort Huachuca and Luke Air Force Base, but the deployment was defensive, perimeter containment, not rescue. The national response was focused on establishing quarantine boundaries, not on extracting survivors from within the affected zone. "Where's the quarantine line?" Dale asked. "North of Winslow. They're using the I-40 overpass as a checkpoint. Military and National Guard. If you can reach Winslow, they're processing civilians." Winslow was 60 miles north. 60 miles through territory that might or might not be infected, on roads that might or might not be passable, in vehicles we didn't yet have. Rachel called Janine. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Rachel left a message. She said, "Jan, it's me. We're alive. We're north of Heber. We're heading to Winslow. If you get this, go north. Get above the quarantine line. I love you. Please be alive." She hung up and stood holding the receiver for a long moment, then placed it gently in the cradle and walked to the corner of the office and put her back against the wall and slid down to the floor and cried without sound, her shoulders shaking, her hands over her face. And I sat beside her and held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could fill the space her sister's voicemail had hollowed out. Dr. Liang called a colleague at a hospital in Albuquerque and reached a recording that said the facility was at capacity and diverting all patients. She called a public health contact in Santa Fe and reached a busy signal. She called her own home number in Scottsdale and listened to her own voice on the answering machine and then hung up without leaving a message. Then the line went dead, mid-conversation, as Tomas was trying to reach the Forest Service dispatch in Springerville. The dial tone simply ceased. The phone became an object, plastic and metal, connected to nothing. We slept in the depot that night, arranged between shelves of feed bags and fencing supplies, using horse blankets from the inventory as bedding. Dale and Thomas maintained watch. The rest of us descended into the fractured, insufficient sleep of hunted animals, never fully unconscious, never fully resting, cycling through shallow dreams that were indistinguishable from the reality we were trying to escape. I lay on the concrete floor with Lily between Rachel and me, and Dolores was an arm's reach away in the office chair. And I watched the darkness above me and listened to my daughter breathe, and I assembled, in the architecture of my exhaustion, a plan. We would leave at dawn. We would take the 377 north, using the depot's inventory to supplement our supplies: rope, tools, a tarp, water containers. We would move as a group, maintaining pace for our slowest member, because leaving anyone behind was not a strategy I was willing to adopt regardless of its tactical logic. We would reach Winslow. We would cross the quarantine line. We would be processed, documented, sheltered, fed, We would become survivors in the bureaucratic sense. Names on a list, bodies in a gymnasium, recipients of aid that would taste like grace because we would be alive to taste it. The plan was simple. Its simplicity was its strength and its lie, because nothing ahead of us was simple. And the 60 miles between the depot and Winslow contained decisions that would cost us parts of ourselves we didn't know we could lose. But that night, lying on concrete in a feed store in a town I'd never heard of, surrounded by people who'd been strangers 30 hours ago and were now the closest thing to a community I had left, I held my daughter's hand and my wife's hand, and I believed the plan was possible because I had to, because belief was the only resource that didn't deplete with use. Dawn came. We loaded packs. Dale opened the depot door. The road north was empty and bright and terrifying, and we walked into it. We reached Winslow on the third day. Not all of us. Irene Salazar broke her ankle at mile 31 and insisted we leave her with water and a weapon at a gas station that still had intact walls. We refused. Tomas carried her on his back for 4 miles until we found an abandoned ranch truck with half a tank of gas and keys above the visor. Grace drove. Irene rode in the bed with her foot elevated on a bale of hay. The checkpoint was a wall of Humvees and concertina wire, manned by National Guard soldiers who looked 18 and exhausted and afraid. They processed us with thermal scanners and questionnaires and the mechanical compassion of people following procedures that had been written for scenarios less severe than the one they were living through. Dolores was taken to a medical tent. Lily was given a juice box and a coloring book. Rachel sat on a cot in a high school gymnasium surrounded by 400 other survivors, and finally let herself feel the full weight of what we'd lost. And the sound she made was not crying. It was deeper than crying. It was the sound of a person's interior landscape being redrawn. I stood outside the gymnasium in the Winslow sun and called Janine's number from a borrowed satellite phone. It went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Some silences say more than words ever could. Victor Reyes gave us 20 minutes. We used 19. And now, in the quiet after, I measure everything against those minutes. Every choice, every hesitation, every moment I held my daughter's hand and chose to keep walking. That is how we survived. Not with courage, with momentum,